we know what we need to do in the weeks and months ahead. I look forward to working on those issues with my colleagues. Mr. President, I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
On day 16 of the government shutdown, votes are expected here in the Senate this evening on an agreement reached between Senate leaders that would fund the federal government through January 15th and raise the debt ceiling until February 7th. Jennifer Bendery of the Huffington Post sent a tweet about the timing for votes tonight from the House GOP Whip's office. Senate will vote between 6 and 7 p.m. And Chad Pergram of Fox News tweets, no House votes expected until 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern Time at the earliest, but those may not be the final votes. Now we're going to go back to earlier today to hear Senate leaders Rita McConnell announcing the deal.
Could we have order in the Senate?
The Senate is in a quorum call.
I would ask, thank you for reminding me of that also. I ask unanimous consent to call the quorum be terminated.
Without objection.
Madam President, the eyes of the world have been in Washington all this week, and that is a gross understatement. And while they witnessed a great deal of political discord, today they will also see Congress reach a historic bipartisan agreement to reopen the government and avert a default on the nation's bills. The compromise we reached will provide our economy with the stability it desperately needs. It's never easy for two sides to reach consensus. It's really hard, sometimes harder than others. This time was really hard. But after weeks spent facing off across a partisan divide that often seemed too wide to cross, our country came to the brink of a disaster. But in the end, political adversaries set aside their differences and disagreements to prevent that disaster. I thank the Republican leader for his diligent efforts to reach this important agreement. The Republican leader's cooperation was essential to reach an accord that could pass both chambers of Congress and also be signed by President Obama. As part of our agreement, in order to assure Congress continues the work of setting this country on a path of fiscal sustainability, this legislation instructs leaders to name conferees to a budget conference committee that will set our country on a long-term path to fiscal sustainability. Madam President, I know that some say that's going to be hard, but what we do is hard here, and this is really hard, but I think we can get it done. The committee members selected must have open minds, be willing to consider every option, no matter how painful to their own political ideas and even their own political parties. This conference committee, led by Chairman Murray and Chairman Ryan, which will produce its negotiated budget resolution in December, is the appropriate place to discuss our different views of the best way to chart a course for economic growth. This legislation also funds the government through January 15th and averts default through February 7th, during which time we can work toward a long-term budget agreement that prevents these frequent crises. And perhaps most importantly, this legislation ends a standoff to ground the work of Washington to a halt this fall. Madam President, this is not a time for pointing fingers of blame. This is a time of reconciliation. I look forward to working with my colleagues on both sides of this great Capitol to pass this remarkable agreement which will protect the long-term health of our economy and avert a default on our nation's debt and allow us to set a foundation for economic expansion. What we've done is send a message to Americans from every one of our 50 states, but in addition to that, to the citizens of every country in the world, that the United States lives up to its obligations. Now Congress must return to its most important job, fostering economic growth and protecting middle-class families. I appreciate through all this the steady hand of President Obama who helped guide us to this conclusion. I'm optimistic that the spirit of compromise that has taken root in the Senate over the last 2 days will endure. I do know this. Senator McConnell and I have sat in very, very serious discussions the last few days. We're going to do everything we can to change the atmosphere in the Senate and accomplish things that need to be done for our country.
Madam President.
The Republican leader.
This has been a long, challenging few weeks for Congress and for the country. It's my hope that today we can put some of those most urgent issues behind us. After yesterday's events, the Majority Leader and I began a series of conversations about a way to get the government reopened and to prevent default. I'm confident we'll be able to do both those things later today. Crucially, I'm also confident that we'll be able to announce that we're protecting the government spending reductions that both parties agreed to under the Budget Control Act and that the President signed into law. That's been a top priority for me and for my colleagues on the Republican side of the aisle throughout this debate, and it's been worth the effort. Some have suggested that we break that promise as part of this agreement. Some have said Washington needs to spend more, that we need to raise taxes, that we need to just tax our way to prosperity and balance. But what the BCA showed is that Washington actually can cut spending. And because of this law, that's just what we've done. For the first time since the Korean War, government spending has declined for 2 years in a row. The first time in 50 years. And we're not going back on this agreement. There's a lot more we need to do to get our nation's fiscal house in order. Hopefully, once we've gotten past the drama of the moment, we can get to work on it. But for now, let's not understate the importance of the Budget Control Act or the importance of the fight to preserve it. This legislation is the largest spending reduction bill of the last quarter century and the largest deficit reduction bill since 1981 that didn't include a tax hike. Preserving this law is critically important to the future of our country. Throughout this debate, the public is rightly focused on Obamacare, for good reason. This law is ravaging our economy, killing jobs, driving up premiums, and driving people off the health care plans they have and like in droves. Its disastrous rollout is a sign of even worse things to come. And the refusal to delay it reflects a kind of stubborn ideological obsession that will do untold damage to our country. And Republicans remain determined to repeal this terrible law. But for today, the relief we hope for is to reopen the government, avoid default, and protect the historic cuts we achieved under the Budget Control Act. This is far less than many of us had hoped for, frankly, but it's far better than what some had sought. Now it's time for Republicans to unite behind other crucial goals. Madam President, I yield the floor.
The Associated Press writes that Tea Party-aligned lawmakers who triggered the shutdown that began on October 1st said that they would vote against the legislation. The story goes on to say that significantly, though, Texas Senator Ted Cruz and others agreed not to use the Senate's rules to slow the bill's progress. Here's Senator Cruz after the deal was announced.
All right, I'll give you all time to set up, so you can relax. I'll give everyone time to set up.
Talking on the Senate floor. Do you want to wait until the leaders are done and then take right away? Would that be okay with everybody?
No. Right now. Good.
Okay, never mind.
All right, hold on. Let me wait till everyone is situated. Unfortunately, once again, it appears the Washington establishment is refusing to listen to the American people. The deal that has been cut provides no relief to the millions of Americans who are hurting because of Obamacare. The deal that has been cut provides no relief to all the young people coming out of school who can't find a job because of Obamacare. It provides no relief to all the single parents who have been forced into part-time work, struggling to feed their kids on 29 hours a week. It provides...
Mr. President, since the government shut down about 16 days ago, I've been coming to the floor of the Senate to express my chagrin at this manufactured crisis. And then, of course, the second manufactured crisis, the crisis of perhaps doing the unthinkable, a default, where we would become a nation that didn't pay our bills for the first time in our history. I think history is going to analyze this period of time in our nation's governance and will not look fondly upon what has happened here. Just this morning, I held a press conference as I'm chairman of the Environment and Public Works Committee to talk about what's happening across the country in this shutdown. Superfund sites, more than 500 not being cleaned up. We had business people there, small business people who have their businesses near wildlife refuges. This is the season where people go hunting and fishing and spend their dollars to help support the tourist industry in our great nation. In many states, tourism is number 1, 2, or 3. In my state of California, it's the number 3 industry. So when a park closes down, or the Army Corps recreation land closes down, or the refuges close down, this isn't just sad because that's not the right thing to do for the environment. It is sad because many people rely on those beautiful areas being open to the public. We need to keep the doors of the government open to the people. This is a government of, by, and for the people. Our government should never be closed. Now, that doesn't mean that we're going to agree on every law or every regulation or every single thing that happens in a government. We're always going to have disagreements. I've said here quite often, I've served with 5 presidents, 3 Republican presidents, 2 Democratic presidents. I'm a Democrat. And there were many times I didn't agree with my president, whether he was a Republican or a Democrat. But I knew there were ways to win the day. You have to stick to your principles and fight the battles and do everything you can to win the moment, to change the law, to change the way a law is enforced, to write a new law, to repeal an old law. But you do it within the framework of governance, not within the framework of chaos. There is never a reason to threaten to close the government. There is never a reason to threaten to default on our debt. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that I place in the record an article that just hit now from Business Insider. May I do that?
Without objection.
Here's what has happened because of this 16-day shutdown. Here's what has happened because that shutdown was paired with a flirtation with a default. The S&P has cut the annualized U.S. growth view closer to 2% from 3%. That's a percentage point off growth. This is what Bloomberg is reporting. The ratings agency, which recognizes the Senate deal will be approved, so this is after they recognize the deal will be approved, and thank God it looks like it will be, says that the shutdown has taken, Mr. President, hear this, $24 billion out of the economy and has cut off 0.6% from the yearly fourth quarter GDP growth. And this is what's so important, and I hope everyone within the sound of my voice hears this. If people are afraid that the government policy brinkmanship will resurface again, and with it the risk of another shutdown or worse, they, the people, will remain afraid to open up their checkbooks. And that points to another humbug holiday season, S&P wrote in the release. And they also said the impact of the debt ceiling is getting worse by the day for the U.S. economy. And there's a full release, and we're putting it in the record. So just to speak in layman's terms about this, what the economists are saying is this shutdown and this flirtation with a default has taken a huge bite out of our economy. A huge bite. And why did we face it? Because some folks didn't like the Health Care Reform Act. Now, it's their total right not to like it. It's their total right not to love it. It's their total right to try and change it. That's all their total right. But you can't shut down the government and stamp your feet and say, because I don't like this and I don't like who's president, I'm shutting down the government. Now, here's the good news, and it is good news. Bipartisanship here in the Senate is leading America out of this painful, partisan, self-inflicted crisis. And as someone from the largest state in the Union, I can tell you, relief doesn't even begin to describe how I feel. And I am also grateful to the two leaders who came together, the Democratic leader, the Republican leader of the Senate, both who have had many disagreements and will continue to in the future about the proper road ahead. But when history called them, they were there. They were able to set aside their differences and reach an agreement to open up this government, to pay our bills, and to set out a path to negotiation on all those differences that we know we have between the two parties, very legitimate differences. I think what we learn as we read the S&P comments here is that this has to end. This brinksmanship has to end. We have to say, as Americans, you don't have to shut the government down. You don't have to threaten to default. That's not the way we should proceed. It's too painful for this nation. It's too costly, $24 billion. That's what S&P puts on it. That's what's taken out of the economy. That doesn't even include what it cost us as a federal government to shut down, to reopen, to start again. But bipartisanship here in the Senate is leading the way forward. You know, we always are told, if you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat it. And that is the reason why I have tried, and many others have on, frankly, both sides, to come down here and talk about the mess that we have been in. You know, I like to say that if you're walking down the street, it's a pretty nice day, and you feel good, and the sun is a little bit behind the clouds, but looks like it's going to come out. You got a few problems at work you have to work on. You've got a couple of kids you're worried about. You're thinking about how you're going to go on that next vacation, but you feel pretty good and optimistic. You got problems, but everything's manageable. Why would you hit yourself in the head with a brick at that very moment? And that's really what this self-inflicted wound on our nation has been about. Yes, we have our problems. Yes, we're coming out of the worst recession since the Great Depression. Yes, we have to deal with deficits, debts, with education, with the environment, with climate change. We can go on of all those. Yes, America has its issues. Of course we have. But we don't need self-inflicted wounds. We have enough issues that are critical, including world peace and, Iran's nuclear ambitions and serious chemical weapons. And I serve on the Foreign Relations Committee. Everything has taken a back seat to this. Now, I'm very happy I learned that the House is planning, assuming this all goes well tonight and everybody votes to open up this government and pay our bills, that the House is going to take up the Water Resources Development Act next week. That is a bill that passed here by more than 80 votes. And, Mr. President, it's critical. It addresses flood control. It addresses dredging of our ports. It has a recreation piece. It has a lot of important policy in it to help move our nation forward. And most important, 500,000 jobs depend on our passing WRDA. So from what I've read, that WRDA bill is going to come forward, and I'm very pleased. And then we'll take our bills to conference. That's the way we do things here. We resolve our differences in the conference, and I feel Chairman Schuster and I can do that with our colleagues, and we'll have a vote on something that creates jobs and moves us forward. In the meantime, we've been mired for 2 weeks in a government shutdown and a frightening inching up to the default date. That has taken the wind out of our sails, the wind out of America's sails. It has taken our energy. All of us are very, shall we say, we're still even a little anxious as we speak until this is done. It's been a couple of weeks of anxiety, of great difficulty. And here we are. What about the people out there who have suffered, who have worked without a paycheck? Worked without a paycheck. Policemen, firemen, all of our workers still working without paychecks. And we are on the verge of correcting that in moments. And I can only say that I am very thankful to our two leaders. I am very thankful to the bipartisan team. I don't want to start naming names because I'm fearful I will forget some, but I know that Senator McCain was part of it, Senator Collins was part of it, Senator Donnelly, Senator Klobuchar, and Senator Heitkamp, and I know I'm leaving people out, which I didn't want to do. I think Senator Johans was part of the team, and Senator Flake. So if I left anybody out, I'll correct it in the record. But I am ever so grateful. I just thought Senators Ayotte and Murkowski. I think that may cover it. Senator King. Just doing this by memory here. They got together when things looked grim, and they said, the Senate's going to lead. And I'm so grateful to them, because even as things faltered, they were still at it, still working. Senator Pryor, part of that group. They just didn't give up. And to me, that is so important. We need to talk to each other. We need to work together. How did we get 80-some votes for a WRDA bill? It was bipartisan. How did we get all those votes we had last time for the highway bill? It was bipartisan. We worked together. As chairman of that EPW committee, really the things that we get done are all bipartisan. And when we get into our corners, it's not good. And when we try to use as leverage the very government itself or the debt ceiling itself, it doesn't work. So in closing, I'm going to say again what this article says. S&P, if people are afraid that the government policy brinkmanship will resurface again, and with it the risk of another shutdown or worse, they will remain afraid to open up their checkbooks, and that points to another humbug holiday season, meaning the Christmas season, which is so critical to our economy. So we need to learn from this sad history of the last few weeks that, yes, we will have our disagreements. Yes, we will always. That's the greatness of our nation, is that we do have freedom of thought, and we do have different political parties, and we do have different ways of looking at things. It's fine. But don't ever shut down the government. Don't ever play games with the full faith and credit of America. Let's just get to the negotiating table, and we'll be just fine. We'll work those differences out. And the last thing is elections. Elections have consequences. This is where you battle it out. In the next one, we're going to battle this out. That's important. And, you know, we never said it would be smooth sailing, but we have to keep the government open and we have to pay our bills. And I hope that's what we learned. So I'm looking forward to the next hour and a half or so when I expect we'll be voting, maybe a little sooner. And I thank you very much, Mr. President, for your leadership in all this darkness of times, and I yield the floor.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
A vote is planned this evening to reopen the government and raise the nation's borrowing limit here in the Senate, and if it passes, it'll go to the House tonight for a vote. Senator Rubio spoke on the Senate floor this afternoon and released a statement saying in part, "I cannot support this deal because it postpones any significant action on pro-growth and spending reforms and does nothing to provide working-class Americans even one shred of relief from Obamacare's harmful effects." That from Senator Rubio. Senator Ted Cruz also says he'll vote against the agreement but will not try to slow down the bill's progress. Here's Senator Cruz after the announcement of the deal today.
All right, I'll give you all time to set up, so you can relax. I'll give everyone time to set up.
They're still talking on the Senate floor. Do you want to wait until the leaders are done and then come right away?
Put down the Capitol.
Would that be okay with everybody?
I know. Do it.
Okay, never mind.
All right, hold on. Let me wait till everyone is situated. Unfortunately, once again, it appears the Washington establishment is refusing to listen to the American people. The deal that has been cut provides no relief to the millions of Americans who are hurting because of Obamacare. The deal that has been cut provides no relief to all the young people coming out of school who can't find a job because of Obamacare. It provides no relief to all the single parents who have been forced into part-time work, struggling to feed their kids on 29 hours a week. It provides no relief to all the hard-working families who are facing skyrocketing health insurance premiums, and it provides no relief to all the seniors, to all the people with disabilities who are right now getting in the mail notifications from their health insurance companies that they're losing their health insurance because of Obamacare. It is unfortunate that Washington is not listening to the people. Now, I want to commend the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives has taken a bold stance listening to the American people, but unfortunately, the United States Senate has refused to do likewise. The United States Senate has stayed with the traditional approach of the Washington establishment of maintaining the status quo and doing nothing to respond to the suffering that Obamacare is causing millions of Americans. This is unfortunate, but nobody should be surprised that the Washington establishment is pushing back. Nobody should be surprised at the resistance to change. Let me say, the American people in the last few months have risen up in overwhelming numbers. We have seen millions of Americans all over this country working to change Washington. That has been incredible progress, and this fight, this debate will continue until collectively the American people can make D.C. listen, can get real relief for all of the people who are hurt because of Obamacare. You want to know what this fight is about? It's about one thing. It is about all of the people across this country who are right now facing terrifying decisions because they're losing their health care, they're losing their jobs, they're being left in the cold. And sadly, the United States Senate has said, Washington will do nothing. It has created the problems you're facing, but Washington will do nothing to address the suffering you're feeling. That is unfortunate, but this debate and this fight will continue in the months ahead.
Senator, there was a two-part question here. Number one, will you filibuster?
What's the second part?
The second part is, if you're not going to filibuster, will you take a significant amount of time that is not a true filibuster to punt this into tomorrow?
There have been many questions about the timing of this vote. The timing of this vote, it is my understanding from leadership, is likely to occur today. I have no objections to the timing of this vote, and the reason is simple. There's nothing to be gained from delaying this vote 1 day or 2 days. The outcome will be the same. Every senator, every member of the House is going to have to make a decision where he or she stands. But there's no benefit. I've never had any intention of delaying the timing of this vote. And indeed, I thought it was interesting reading in the papers that much speculation about whether we might delay the timing of the vote. Republican leadership never asked if I intended to delay the timing of the vote. My focus is on the substance. My focus is, I think, where the American people's focus is, which is what are we doing to provide real relief to the people who are hurting because of Obamacare. And unfortunately, today, the answer is the United States Senate and the Washington establishment is doing nothing to provide relief for the millions of people who are hurting because of Obamacare.
Can I just ask you about where we are right now? As you well know, you have a lot of fellow Republicans really downright angry at you because here we are, almost 3 weeks later, the strategy that you started out on to defund Obamacare as part of funding the government, they never thought was going to work because the votes aren't there. And here we are reopening the government after a lot of bruising political warfare internally, and you got nothing for it.
Well, Dana, respectfully, I disagree with the premise of that. I think we have seen a remarkable thing happen. Months ago, when the effort to defund Obamacare began, official Washington scoffed. They scoffed that the American people would rise up. They scoffed that the House of Representatives would do anything, and they scoffed that the Senate would do anything. We saw, first of all, millions upon millions of Americans rise up all over this country, over 2 million people signing a national petition to defund Obamacare. We saw the House of Representatives take a courageous stand listening to the American people that everyone in official Washington just weeks earlier said would never happen. That was a remarkable victory to see the House engage in a profile in courage. Unfortunately, the Senate chose not to follow the House, and in particular, we saw real division among Senate Republicans. That was unfortunate. I would point out that had Senate Republicans united and supported House Republicans, the outcome of this, I believe, would have been very, very different. I wish that had happened, but it did not. But it does give a path going forward that if the American people continue to rise up, I believe the House will continue to listen to the American people, and I hope in time the Senate begins to listen to the American people also, because, look, lots of people in Washington love to focus on the politics. It is, unfortunately, the game of this town. But what matters more than any politicians in Washington is all of the people across this country who are hurting right now, who are getting in the mail a notification that the health care they're relying on for their care, for their parents' care, for their children's care, that it's being canceled because of Obamacare. President Obama promised the American people Obamacare would lower your health insurance premiums. I would venture to say virtually every person across this country has seen exactly the opposite happen, has seen premiums going up and up and up, and everyone who clicks on Obamacare and sees the premiums going up and up and up. President Obama promised the American people, if you like your health insurance, you can keep it. We now know that statement was flat out categorically false. People all over this country are losing their health insurance. 15,000 UPS employees got a notification in the mail that they were losing spousal coverage, that their husbands and wives were all losing the health insurance that they wanted and they liked. That is happening all over the country. It's wrong. And the focus, in my view, should not be on the politics of Washington. The politics of Washington at the end of the day doesn't matter. What the focus should be is on making Washington, D.C. listen to the American people and respond to the very real harms that Obamacare is causing to millions of people. Thank you very much.
That was Senator Ted Cruz this afternoon after a Senate deal was announced between leaders to reopen the government and raise the debt ceiling. The Houston Chronicle editorial board wrote an editorial about its endorsement of Senator Cruz in the Senate race last year, saying he has failed to live up to their expectations. Part of the editorial reads, "When we endorsed Ted Cruz in last November's general election, we did so with many reservations and at least one specific recommendation, that he follow Hutchison's example in his conduct as a senator. Obviously, he has not done so. Cruz has been part of the problem in specific situations where Hutchison would have been part of the solution." And that editorial was titled, "Why We Miss K. Bailey Hutchison." We're taking your comments on Facebook about the agreement to reopen the government and avoid a default on the national debt. Diana writes on Facebook, "We need to form a for the conservative middle class, but with responsible economic plans. Conservatives are held hostage to a Republican economic plan aimed at robbing your savings." And Patricia writes, "The Teapot Party overplayed its hand, and the American people now agree that they care more about their ideology than jobs." We invite you to share your thoughts at facebook.com/cspan. We're seeing some tweets from Jeff Zeleny of ABC News and others that the timing on the Senate vote tonight is between 6 and 7 p.m. Eastern Time, according to aides from Senator Reid. That's coming up here in a few minutes. Senate leaders announced a deal that would reopen the federal government through January 15th and lift the debt ceiling through February 7th. This avoids the immediate threat of default, but also sets the stage for more budget negotiations in the coming months. If the deal is approved by the Senate, it'll go to the House for a vote. And Politico writes that the bill is expected to clear the House, but the level of support from Republicans remains open to question. House Republicans have clung to the so-called Hastert rule, a mantra that the House Speaker should not try to pass a bill that does not have the support of the majority of the majority. In this case, that would mean 117 Republicans must support the bill to avoid getting crosswise with the rule. Top GOP sources say it's unlikely they will reach that level of support. We're going to show you reaction to the deal now from the White House from earlier today with spokesman Jay Carney.
3 deputies. This is pretty much the entirety of the press office staff today. It is a smile. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here, as ever. We can go right to questions because I have no announcements to make, although I'm sure I know what you're going to ask. Julie.
All right. Well, then can you please give us the White House reaction to the Senate deal that was struck today?
The President believes that the bipartisan agreement announced by the leaders of the United States Senate will reopen the government and remove the threat of economic brinksmanship that has already harmed middle-class families, American businesses, and our country's economic standing.
Numbers that are a little bit too big for our constituents and even us to fathom. One number that we throw around, Mr. President, as you know, in Connecticut is the number $50 billion. That is the amount of money that we need over the next 20 years to make the necessary improvements along our rail line in order to just keep it up to a state of good repair. Never mind do the expansions that we so badly need to get our economy back up and running in Connecticut, just to basically do all of the repair work that we need to keep trains running safely from Boston down to Washington, D.C. That's $50 billion that we need to get that done. I give you that number because what we've learned today is that S&P estimates that the cost of this 2-week shutdown to the United States government is $24 billion. Half of what the northeastern states need to maintain a state of good repair on the most important rail line to the nation for the next decade. In 2 weeks, we lost $24 billion to this economy. That's the same amount of money as it took to do the big dig in Boston, and half the money that we need to do important improvements along the longest, biggest, most important stretch of rail line in this country. For nothing. For absolutely nothing. We are hopefully going to get consent on a pathway forward in a mere moments that will allow us to vote on a bill that essentially represents the same offer that's been on the table to both Republicans and Democrats for 2 weeks. Get the government back up and operating until January of next year, extend the debt ceiling until February of next year. But of course, Mr. President, the cost is not just in the short term. It's not just about all of that money that we lost. $2 billion of it was money lost to the Treasury of the United States. It's also what we lose every single day that we continue to move forward on this theory that it's somehow best to run this country by manufactured crisis to manufactured crisis. As the chairman of the Europe Subcommittee on the Foreign Relations Committee, I have gotten the chance to hear on a daily and weekly basis impressions of this country from the outside, from Europe. And they look at this nation with envy because they see the demographic trends which allow this country to stay relatively young compared to the rest of the world. They see relative economic growth here compared to countries in Europe and throughout the industrialized world, and they see us on a pathway to energy independence, whereby we're not going to be reliant on oil in the Middle East. We'll be able to produce, whether it be gas or renewables, here at home. And they look at this place with wonder because they see all of these trend lines running in favor of the United States essentially leapfrogging, catapulting the rest of the world with respect to the global recovery. And the only thing stopping us from that inevitability, that global economic rebirth for the United States, is government by crisis. Mark Zandi came to the Joint Economic Committee. He's a pretty bipartisan economist. He's advised Senator McCain, criticized both parties. He says the same thing. He says that the only thing stopping a robust recovery in this nation is the fact that we essentially write budgets and extend debt ceilings 2, 3, 4 months at a time. And I guess, Mr. President, I come down to the floor because my only hope, my only vision of a paper-thin silver lining to this fiasco over the last 2 weeks is that the American public have just said definitively that they don't want this. They don't want this to be the way the government runs any longer. And that if there's one message to this handful of conservatives, mostly in the House of Representatives, but a few here in the Senate, that has caused this shutdown, the message is pretty simple. They are not going to be able to advance their ideological aims, in this case trying to end or repeal or delay the health care bill by shutting down the government and threatening default on American debt. President Obama and our majority leader had to draw a line here. They had to draw a line because that's what the American public was demanding, that we put an end to this governance by crisis. And if there is a silver lining, it is hopefully that even though we are only extending the continuing resolution and the debt ceiling for a matter of months, that we won't go through this catastrophe again because the American public has just said enough is enough. And they know what we should know here in the Senate. There is enormous room for compromise moving forward. Today, a group of senators held a meeting on delivery system reform. And we had 18 senators come to this meeting today to hear a presentation by the Bipartisan Policy Center on a bipartisan proposal to save over $500 billion to the U.S. Treasury simply by reordering the rules of how we run Medicare, not by trimming benefits, not by requiring more in taxes, simply by reordering the way that we pay for health care. It was a proposal backed by everyone from Bill Frist to Tom Daschle, and it suggests that there is so much room for agreement between Republicans and Democrats if we just decide to set policy for years rather than for months. And so I know we walk away from this with a sense of both outrage and hopefulness that we can maybe figure out a way to come together. But, Mr. President, although this is my first year in the Senate, I've been in this place for 6 years between the House and this body, and this feels like Groundhog Day again in the sense that every time that we find a way through one of these crises, we all say to each other, well, this is the last time. And we all lock arms and say, isn't it great that we found bipartisan agreement, and now we can use this momentum moving forward to make sure that we avoid this kind of crisis in the future. I've seen this play before. And yet it seems that within days or weeks we just fall back to our old habits of digging trenches and fighting each other more than we talk to each other, and again governing by crisis. I think this time is different just because the depth of the dysfunction was different than ever before. The cries from the American public were greater than ever before. But we should remember, as this report from the Bipartisan Policy Center on Delivery System Reform tells us, that there is still enormous room for the two parties to set out goals that we agree on, and if we push aside the most strident extremist voices that largely come from the Tea Party caucus of the House of Representatives, there is so much that we can do. And as my European friends remind me on an almost daily basis, the only thing stopping the American economy from powering forward and becoming once again a giant of manufacturing, of global financial services, of innovation, the only thing stopping us from that leapfrog forward is figuring out that governance by crisis holds us back. We made the promise to each other before that when we get through one of these crises, it will be our last. And I commend our leaders. I commend Leader Reid and Senator Murray for setting up a process by which for the rest of this year we can try to come to some resolution on a budget that sets policy for years rather than for months. This time, Mr. President, though, the promise that we have made to each other has to stick. It's the only way forward for this place, and it's the only way forward from an economy that is just waiting to be unshackled to conquer the world again. I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid and Minority Leader Mitch McConnell announced an agreement to end the government shutdown and raise the debt limit shortly after noon Eastern this afternoon. And you can read the draft legislation of the agreement at cspan.org. We're getting one detail of the deal in a tweet from Jennifer Bendery of the Huffington Post that says, in the Senate bill, employees furloughed as a result of any lapse in appropriations shall be compensated at their standard rate. The Washington Post writes, congressional leaders were closing in on legislation on Wednesday evening to raise the debt limit through February 7th and end the 16-day-old government shutdown as Republicans gave up their costly bid to force President Obama to delay his landmark health care law. In an interview with conservative radio talk show host Bill Cunningham, House Speaker John Boehner said, we fought the good fight, we just didn't win. Another Republican on the Senate floor this afternoon, Senator Marco Rubio, released a statement saying, in part, I cannot support this deal. And here's what he said on the floor.
It now appears that at some point this evening, we will reach the end of the latest Washington manufactured crisis of the month. But unfortunately, the real crisis facing our country remains. And that real crisis is the growing sense among our people that we are losing the American dream. Why do people feel this way? Because more than 4 million Americans have been out of work for 6 months or more. Because millions more find themselves stuck with jobs that do not pay enough for them to live the way they used to. And while their paychecks aren't growing, their bills are. Ask the young couples and the single parents how much they're spending every month to provide child care for their children. Ask the students, the young Americans who are stuck with thousands of dollars in student loans that they're now struggling to pay. This is the real crisis facing America, that our status as a land of opportunity seems to be eroding, and that so many of our political leaders seem oblivious to this. And now, as we emerge from this latest standoff, we have done nothing to address it. There were two issues at play in this showdown. The press coverage mixes them together, but there are two distinct and separate issues, and they should be examined that way. It started with Obamacare, a law that was sold to people as something that would help them get affordable health insurance. But that is not what it's going to be. We've all heard the news of what a fiasco the rollout of the exchanges have been. But as bad as the rollout of the exchanges and the website has been, we need to realize that that was supposed to be the easy part. The most difficult and disruptive parts of that law are yet to come. In the months to come, a new insurance fee, a new tax on hard-working Americans will be added to insurance policies. People will be required to give up existing coverage that they are happy with if it doesn't meet the standards created by Obamacare. And if they don't buy the insurance, they eventually will have to pay a tax that goes up to either $695 a year or 2.5% of your income. Employers with more than 50 full-time employees will be required to offer a certain type of coverage to their employees. So many of them are moving people to part-time work. And full-time, by the way, is no longer defined as 40 hours. It's now 30 hours. So many employers are moving employees to under 30 hours a week. Today, for many Americans, Obamacare is just a website that doesn't work. But in the months to come, this law is going to hurt millions of people. It's going to cost them hours at work and maybe even their job. It's going to cost them the insurance that they have now and are happy with. It's going to force them to leave their existing doctor, and it's going to raise rates for people who buy insurance for themselves. What do we tell these people that are being hurt by this law? To deal with it because it's the law of the land? Is it not our job to fight for them? Is it not our job to be their voice, to protect them from the harmful effects of this law? And that's why I continue to believe that we should not waste a single penny more of taxpayer money on this damaging law. One of the most important powers and responsibilities that we have as members of Congress is the power of the purse. It's under our Constitution. It gives the Congress the power to decide what to spend money on and what not to spend money on from the taxpayer. Now, I know of no one in my party who supported shutting down the government. On the contrary, we argued that we should fund the entire government except for one thing, Obamacare. In fact, the House of Representatives passed a law that did just that. But the Democrats took the position that either we fund Obamacare or we fund nothing at all. They took the position that funding Obamacare was more important than funding the government. And they were willing to put our country through this government shutdown just to save their pet project. Within days of this showdown, by the way, a second issue was added to it, the federal debt limit. Now, the press portrays the debt limit as simply a law that allows us to pay our bills, and therefore they fall for the argument that failing to raise the debt limit means or equals a default on our debt. But the debt limit is a lot more than just simply permission to pay our bills. Every year, our government is spending more money than it takes in, a lot more money than it takes in. And as the years go by, that annual deficit adds up to what we call the national debt, and it's growing at an alarming rate. The debt limit is a law that limits the amount of money the government can have as debt at any single time. But we depend on borrowed money to pay our bills. And so if we don't raise it again, eventually we will not have enough money to pay all of our bills. That should scare us. Reaching the debt limit is like when the bank calls on you to collect on the monthly mortgage payment. If you don't pay them, your home is going to be taken away, your credit's going to be ruined, and your ability to borrow money in the future is going to be hurt. But what if, because you don't make enough money, the only way you can pay your mortgage is by using your credit card? You can't keep doing that forever. And so when the bank calls, you pay the bill, but you also figure out what other expenses to cut so you don't have to keep using your credit card to pay the mortgage. That's what real people in the real world would do. But that's not what we're being asked to do here. They're asking us to just pay the bill and keep using the credit card and let tomorrow worry about tomorrow. We can't keep doing that forever, because at some point even the credit card is going to stop working. Yet that's what's happened here again. And so the debt will keep growing, and with each passing year, we will get closer to the day that we face a real debt crisis. A real debt crisis. Not one caused because the Congress can't pass a bill, but one caused because no one will lend us money anymore. And that's how we arrived at the point we find ourselves at today. We have a president and a majority in the Senate that would rather face a default before seriously dealing with the debt. We have a president and a majority in this Senate that would rather shut down the government before they would shut down Obamacare or even make any meaningful changes to it. So tonight, the government will be reopened and the debt limit will be lifted, but our real problems are still here. And in the months and years to come, they are only going to get bigger and harder to solve. And for those of us who realize this, who clearly understand that the direction we are headed threatens the American dream and all the things that make our country special, this is the time to reflect on the way forward. Because if we do not figure out how to change course around here, if we do not figure out the way to change this course our nation is on, we will forever be known as the generation that ushered in America's decline. And history's not going to distinguish between Republicans and Democrats. It will judge us all harshly for our failure to act. To avoid this fate, we must once and for all begin to address the national debt. Not with accounting gimmicks, but with real and measurable steps. It doesn't have to be solved in one sweeping measure, but we must begin the work of moving towards a sustainable level of spending. This will take time, because we're still saddled by too many leaders unwilling to address the issue in a meaningful way. So let's do what we can while they're still here. And at the same time, let's work to replace these irresponsible leaders on the left with leaders who will finally step up and save our nation from the real debt crisis that awaits us. As for Obamacare, it too will be harshly judged by history. And that's why I'm personally so disappointed that we were not able to achieve any meaningful changes to it. But this fight is not over. It's really only just begun. For in the months to come, millions of Americans will begin to confront the costs and the consequences of this law. It will be the reason why they're now working part-time. It will be the reason why they lost the insurance they used to have. It will be the reason why they can't see the doctor they've been seeing for all these years. It will be the reason why their insurance premiums have gone through the roof. We've been warning people about this for years, and we've done everything we can to keep this harm from reaching our people. But now Obamacare is going to start hurting real people in real ways, and when it does, there is going to be a mad scramble in this town to fix it or get rid of it. This has happened before. In June of 1988, Congress passed a bill called the Medicare Catastrophic Coverage Act. It promised new medical benefits for the elderly, a cap on hospital and doctor bills, provided prescription medicine, and then the true cost of the program began to reach the American people. And as seniors began to learn the true cost of this new program, it fueled a revolt. Now, at first, the politicians minimized it. They minimized the protest. They refused to make any changes to it. But before long, the onslaught of calls and mail was so much that it became impossible to ignore. And before long, Congress was in full retreat, and by 1989, it was fully replaced. Now, for Obamacare, that day of reckoning is also coming. You know, over the last few months, I've been startled by the number of people who have told me that they're ready to give up. They're ready to give up on the idea that we can make a difference. They're ready to give up on the idea that things will ever get better. But we cannot give up on America. And we cannot give up on the American dream. We cannot give up, because where are we going to go? If this country declines, if we lose what makes it special, what's going to replace it? And so no matter how long it takes, no matter how many disappointments lie ahead, we must never give up. And we must never accept that this way of life today is the new normal. As for those around the world who look at all these events of the last few days and believe that it's evidence that our best days are behind us, you don't understand our people. Our politics does not define our country. We are a unique people, a collection of men and women with sharply different views, with different backgrounds and beliefs. We share a free society, and everyone has a right to express their views, to argue and to battle and to debate. Sometimes our differences bring us to points of great conflict, when the nation appears on the verge of being ripped apart at the seams. But yet for over 200 years we have been held together, because while we're divided on many things...
Mr. President, here we are again. Another